Christmas Day, 1989. The sound of gunfire echoes through a military courtyard in Târgoviște, Romania. Nicolae Ceaușescu, the man who ruled Romania with an iron fist for over 2 decades, lies dead alongside his wife Elena. But while the world watched the dramatic fall of Europe's last communist dictator, a different story was unfolding in the shadows, one involving the extensive Ceaușescu family network that had controlled Romania for decades. What happened to the brothers and sisters who had shared in Nicolae's power? How did they survive the collapse of the regime that had made them wealthy and influential? Some would face tragic ends, others would disappear into obscurity, and a few would attempt to rebuild their lives from the ashes of their family's legacy. This is the untold story of the Ceaușescu siblings after the execution that changed everything. To understand what happened after December 1989, we must first grasp the extraordinary extent of the Ceaușescu family's control over Romania. Nicolae wasn't just a dictator. He was the head of what many called Europe's most extensive political dynasty. Born into a peasant family in Scornicești, he was one of 10 children, 9 of whom survived to adulthood. But Nicolae's rise to power wasn't a solo journey. He systematically placed his siblings in key positions throughout the Romanian government and Communist Party apparatus. This wasn't unusual for communist leaders, but the Ceaușescu family took nepotism to unprecedented levels. By the 1980s, virtually every major government position was held by a Ceaușescu family member or their spouse. Of Ceaușescu's 5 brothers, Nicolae was a major general, Ion was a deputy minister of agriculture, Marin was a consul at the Romanian embassy in Vienna, and Florea was a senior editorial writer for the party newspaper. The sisters weren't left out either. They held influential positions in various state organizations and cultural institutions. This extensive family network created what foreign observers described as a parallel power structure within the Romanian state. Each sibling controlled their own sphere of influence, creating a web of patronage and control that extended far beyond Nicolae himself. They lived in luxury while ordinary Romanians suffered under severe austerity measures, rationing, and constant surveillance. The family's lifestyle was opulent by any standard, but especially stark in contrast to the poverty of average Romanian citizens. They had access to Western goods, traveled freely, and lived in palatial homes while their countrymen waited in bread lines. This contrast would become a source of particular rage when the revolution finally came. But what made the Ceaușescu family particularly vulnerable was how intertwined their fate had become with Nicolae's regime. Unlike other communist leaders who might distance their families from direct political involvement, Nicolae had made them integral to his system of control. When that system collapsed, they wouldn't just lose their privileges, they would become targets. The question that would soon become urgent for each surviving sibling was simple. How do you escape the shadow of being a Ceaușescu when your very name has become synonymous with oppression? Of all Nicolae's siblings, perhaps none faced a more dramatic reckoning than Marin Ceaușescu. As the Romanian trade representative in Vienna, Marin had spent years living in the comfortable bubble of diplomatic immunity, far from the harsh realities of life in Romania under his brother's rule. He had become accustomed to the privileges of his position, the diplomatic passport, the elegant residence, the respect that came with representing a nation on the international stage. But on Christmas Day, 1989, everything changed. As news of Nicolae and Elena's execution spread across Europe, Marin found himself in an impossible position. He was no longer a diplomat representing a legitimate government. He was the brother of a dead dictator, stranded in a foreign country, with nowhere to go. The psychological pressure must have been immense. Within hours, Marin went from being an important diplomatic figure to being a liability. The new Romanian government would certainly not want him back, and Austria had no reason to extend protection to someone associated with the fallen regime. His diplomatic immunity was effectively meaningless, and he likely faced the prospect of extradition back to Romania, where he would almost certainly face trial and possible execution. For 3 days after his brother's death, Marin remained in the Romanian Trade Mission building in Vienna. What went through his mind during those final hours remains a mystery, but the weight of his family name and the hopelessness of his situation must have been overwhelming. On December 28, 1989, Marin Ceaușescu, 74, was found hanged in the basement of the Romanian Trade Mission in Vienna, which he headed. The official report listed his death as taking his own life, though some conspiracy theories would later suggest otherwise. However, given the circumstances and the complete collapse of everything he had known, the official conclusion seems the most plausible. Marine's death represented more than just a personal tragedy. It was a stark illustration of how completely the Ceaușescu world had collapsed. A man who had spent decades representing Romania on the international stage, who had enjoyed respect and influence, found himself so cornered by circumstances that he saw no way forward. His death also sent a chilling message to the other surviving siblings. The Ceaușescu name was no longer a source of power and protection. It had become a death sentence. But Marin's story was just the beginning of the family's post-execution struggles. While he chose to end his life rather than face an uncertain future, others would have to find different ways to cope with their changed circumstances. If Marine's story ended in tragedy, his brother Elia's was marked by a different kind of fall from grace. Lieutenant General Nicolae Ceaușescu had been one of the most powerful figures in the Romanian military hierarchy, serving as Deputy Defense Minister and Secretary of the Supreme Political Council of the Romanian Armed Forces. His position gave him enormous influence over the country's security apparatus and military policy. Unlike Marine, who was safely abroad when the revolution began, Ili was in Bucharest when the crowds took to the streets. As Deputy Defense Minister, he would have been intimately involved in the government's response to the uprising. This put him in an extremely precarious position when the military switched sides and turned against the Ceaușescu regime. The revolution that toppled Nicolae happened with stunning speed. On December 21st, Nicolae was still confident enough to address a crowd from the balcony of the Communist Party headquarters. By December 22nd, he and Elena were fleeing Bucharest in a helicopter. The military's defection was crucial to this rapid collapse, but it also meant that military officers who had been loyal to the regime suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of history. Lieutenant General Nicolae Ceaușescu, 63, Deputy Defense Minister and Secretary of the Supreme Political Council of the Romanian Armed Forces, was arrested during the revolution and remains in custody in the Romanian capital of Bucharest. His arrest came as part of the broader roundup of regime officials, but his status as Nicolae's brother made him a particularly valuable prisoner. For someone who had spent decades wielding military authority and enjoying the privileges of high rank, imprisonment represented a complete reversal of fortune. Ili went from being one of the most feared men in Romania to being just another prisoner awaiting an uncertain fate. The same military institutions he had helped control were now his captors. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. Military officers, especially those of high rank, are accustomed to command, respect, and a clear hierarchical structure. To suddenly find oneself at the bottom of that hierarchy, dependent on the mercy of former subordinates, must have been devastating. Unlike his brother Marin, however, Ili chose to face whatever consequences awaited him. Perhaps his military training had instilled in him a different approach to adversity, or perhaps he simply had more hope that he might survive the transition. His decision to remain and face trial would have far-reaching consequences for his future, but Ili's imprisonment was just the beginning of a longer journey that would test his ability to survive in a world where the Ceaușescu name carried only negative associations. While the male members of the Ceaușescu family often held highly visible positions in government and military hierarchies, the sisters had generally maintained lower profiles. This relative anonymity would prove to be their salvation in the chaotic aftermath of the revolution. Nicolae Ceaușescu, Nicolae's eldest sister, had been the one who initially took him in when he fled his childhood home as a teenager. She had witnessed his rise from a young apprentice shoemaker to the most powerful man in Romania. Her early role in his life made her story particularly poignant, but it also made her a potential target for those seeking revenge against the family. The sisters understood something that perhaps their more prominent brothers had missed. In the new Romania, visibility meant vulnerability. Rather than attempting to maintain their positions or fight for their former privileges, they chose a different strategy. They disappeared into the background of Romanian society. This wasn't easy for women who had been accustomed to a certain level of respect and comfort. The wives and sisters of high-ranking communist officials enjoyed significant social status in pre-revolutionary Romania. They had access to special stores, better health care, and cultural privileges that were denied to ordinary citizens. Suddenly, they found themselves not just stripped of these privileges, but actively hiding their identities. The psychological adjustment must have been enormous. Imagine going from being someone whose name opened doors and commanded respect to being someone who feared recognition. The sisters had to learn to live as ordinary Romanian women, something they may never have truly experienced as adults. Some chose to change their names. Others moved to different parts of the country where they were less likely to be recognized. A few may have left Romania entirely, though this would have been difficult given the scrutiny on anyone associated with the former regime. The key to their survival was becoming invisible, blending into the general population in a way that their more prominent brothers simply couldn't manage. Their success in avoiding the spotlight means that their individual stories remain largely unknown. This anonymity, while protecting them from persecution, also meant that their experiences of loss, adaptation, and survival went unrecorded. They became footnotes in the larger story of the Ceaușescu family's downfall, but their ability to disappear and rebuild their lives in obscurity would prove to be a more successful strategy than the approaches taken by their brothers. Among Nicolae's brothers, Florea and Ion represented different paths to survival in post-revolutionary Romania. Both had held significant positions during the communist era, but neither had achieved the prominence or notoriety of Moran or Ilie. This middle ground would prove crucial to their ability to navigate the dangerous post-execution period. Florea Ceaușescu had worked as a senior editorial writer for Shintea, the official newspaper of the Romanian Communist Party. This position had given him influence over the regime's propaganda machine and made him complicit in spreading the ideology that had oppressed the Romanian people for decades. However, his role, while important, was less visible than that of his military or diplomatic brothers. When the revolution came, Florea faced a dilemma common to many communist-era intellectuals and journalists. How do you reinvent yourself when your entire career has been built on promoting an ideology that has just been violently rejected? Unlike politicians or military officers who could claim they were just following orders, journalists and propagandists had actively shaped public discourse. The transition proved challenging, but not impossible. Romania's new media landscape desperately needed experienced writers and editors, even if their backgrounds were questionable. Some former communist journalists were able to reinvent themselves as independent voices, though this often required publicly repudiating their previous work and embracing democratic values. Ion Ceaușescu, who had served as Deputy Minister of Agriculture, faced similar challenges. Agriculture was one of the most problematic sectors of the Romanian economy under communist rule, marked by collective farming failures and food shortages that had made life miserable for ordinary Romanians. As deputy minister, Ion bore some responsibility for these failures. However, agricultural expertise was still valuable in the new Romania. The country needed people who understood farming systems and rural communities, even if the previous approach had been flawed. This created opportunities for former agricultural officials to remain involved in the sector, provided they could demonstrate genuine commitment to reform. Both Florea and Ion seem to have chosen the path of quiet adaptation rather than confrontation or dramatic reinvention. They didn't seek to defend the old regime or claim they had been misunderstood. Instead, they tried to blend into the new Romanian society, using their skills where possible while avoiding any actions that might draw attention to their family connection. This strategy of keeping a low profile and focusing on practical contributions rather than political positions allowed them to avoid the tragic fate of Moran or the imprisonment of Ilie. They survived by becoming ordinary citizens in a way that the more prominent members of their family simply couldn't achieve. The Ceaușescu family's influence had extended far beyond Nicolae's immediate siblings. Through marriages, appointments, and political alliances, they had created a vast network of relatives and associates who held positions throughout the Romanian government and society. When Nicolae fell, this entire network faced scrutiny and persecution. In-laws, cousins, and even distant relatives found themselves tainted by association with the fallen regime. Some had genuinely earned their positions through merit, but the family connection made this irrelevant in the eyes of revolutionary justice. The new government and angry citizens made little distinction between those who had actively participated in oppression and those who had simply benefited from family connections. The economic consequences were immediate and severe. Properties were seized, assets were frozen, and families that had lived in luxury for decades suddenly found themselves destitute. Children who had grown up with every advantage now faced a hostile world where their family name was a liability rather than an asset. Educational opportunities disappeared overnight. Young Ceaușescus who had been on track for university admissions or promising careers found doors slammed shut. Some had to change their names to have any hope of building normal lives. The sins of the family were visited upon even the youngest generation, who had no choice in their circumstances. The psychological impact on the extended family was profound. Many had genuinely believed in the communist system, or at least accepted it as the natural order. The revelation of the regime's brutality and the intensity of public hatred came as a shock. Family members had to confront not just the loss of their privileges, but the realization that they had been associated with genuine evil. Some family members attempted to distance themselves by publicly denouncing Nicolae and the regime. Others argued that they had been kept in the dark about the worst abuses. A few claimed to have been secret dissidents all along, though such claims were met with skepticism. The challenge was that any public statement, whether supportive or critical of the regime, risked drawing attention to their family connection. The fragmentation of the extended family network was perhaps one of the most lasting consequences of Nicolae's execution. Relationships that had been built on shared power and privilege couldn't survive the complete reversal of circumstances. Family members who had once been close found themselves isolated from each other, each pursuing their own survival strategy. As the initial chaos of the revolution settled into the longer-term process of building a new Romania, the surviving Ceaușescu family members had to develop sustainable strategies for living with their toxic family name. The approaches they chose reveal much about human adaptability and the lengths people will go to escape their past. Name changes became common, though not always successful. In a small country like Romania, people have long memories, and changing documentation couldn't erase decades of public association with the regime. Some family members discovered that their attempts to assume new identities only drew more attention to their efforts to hide. Geographic relocation proved more effective. Romania's post-revolutionary chaos created opportunities for people to disappear into different regions, where they were less likely to be recognized. Rural areas, in particular, offered anonymity that major cities couldn't provide. Some family members became agricultural workers or small business owners in remote communities, where their past was unknown. The most successful survivors seemed to be those who embraced complete lifestyle changes. Former party officials became manual laborers, diplomats became shop clerks, and military officers took up farming. These dramatic career changes weren't just about avoiding recognition. They represented genuine attempts to build new identities based on honest work rather than political connections. Some family members chose the path of public penance, actively working to help those who had been harmed by the regime. While this approach risked drawing attention to their family connections, it also offered a way to rebuild their moral standing in society. A few became involved in efforts to document communist-era abuses or assist victims of political persecution. The psychological challenges were immense. Many family members suffered from what could be described as a form of survivor's guilt. They had enjoyed privileges and comfort while others suffered, and they had done so based on family connections rather than merit. Coming to terms with this reality while simultaneously trying to build new lives required enormous emotional resilience. Children and young adults in the family faced particular challenges. They had to construct adult identities while carrying the burden of their family history. Some succeeded in building successful careers and families, but only after years of struggle, and often requiring them to completely reinvent themselves. The most tragic cases were those family members who couldn't adapt to their changed circumstances. Some suffered from depression and other mental health issues. Others turned to alcohol or other destructive behaviors. A few simply gave up trying to build new lives and retreated into isolation. Perhaps no group faced greater challenges than the children and grandchildren of the Ceaușescu siblings. These young people had grown up in a world where their family name meant power, privilege, and respect. Overnight, that same name became a source of shame and danger. The educational impact was immediate and devastating. Students were expelled from universities, promising careers were derailed, and academic achievements were called into question. Young people who had been groomed for leadership roles in communist Romania suddenly found themselves unemployable in the new democratic system. The social ostracism was perhaps even more damaging than the economic consequences. Former friends and classmates turned their backs on family members. Teachers refused to provide references, and romantic relationships ended abruptly. Young Ceaușescus discovered that their social circles had been based on fear and opportunism, rather than genuine friendship. Some of the younger generation chose to emigrate, seeking opportunities in Western countries where their family history might be less well known. This wasn't easy in the early 1990s, when emigration procedures were complex and expensive, but some managed to build new lives abroad. The price of this escape was permanent separation from their homeland, and often from family members who couldn't or wouldn't leave. Others decided to stay and fight for their right to build normal lives in Romania. This required enormous courage and persistence. They had to prove themselves repeatedly, working harder than their peers to overcome the prejudice associated with their family name. Some succeeded in building respectable careers, but only after years of struggle and discrimination. The psychological impact on the younger generation was profound. Many reported feeling anger at their parents and grandparents for placing them in such an impossible situation. Others felt guilt for having enjoyed privileges that were denied to their peers. Some struggled with identity issues, unsure whether they should embrace or reject their family heritage. Educational achievements became particularly important for young family members seeking to build legitimate careers. They understood that they would need to be exceptional to overcome the prejudice they faced. Some pursued advanced degrees, others developed specialized skills, and many went into fields where merit could be more easily demonstrated than in politics or government service. The most successful young family members seemed to be those who found ways to use their experiences constructively. Some became advocates for human rights or democratic institutions, using their unique perspective to contribute to Romania's transition. Others channeled their struggles into creative pursuits, producing art, literature, or journalism that reflected their complex relationship with their family history. The fall of the Ceaușescu regime had international implications that extended far beyond Romania's borders. The family's extensive diplomatic and business connections created both opportunities and complications for surviving members seeking to build new lives abroad. During the communist era, the Ceaușescu family had maintained relationships with officials and business people throughout Eastern Europe and beyond. Some of these connections proved valuable after 1989, providing opportunities for family members to relocate and start over in foreign countries. However, these same connections also made some family members valuable intelligence assets, attracting attention from various security services. The intelligence dimension added another layer of complexity to the family's post-execution situation. Western intelligence agencies were interested in what family members might know about communist-era operations, Soviet military capabilities, and other sensitive topics. This created opportunities for some family members to trade information for protection or assistance, but it also made them targets for those who wanted to keep certain secrets buried. Some family members found refuge in Western European countries, particularly those with significant Romanian emigrant communities. These diaspora networks provided both practical assistance and cultural continuity for family members trying to rebuild their lives. However, even in emigrant communities, the Ceaușescu name carried baggage that made integration challenging. The United States proved to be a particularly complicated destination for family members. America's role in Cold War intelligence operations meant that some family members possessed information of potential value to U.S. authorities. This created opportunities for asylum or immigration, but also raised questions about whether family members were genuine refugees or potential security risks. Language barriers presented additional challenges for family members seeking to build new lives abroad. Many had been educated in Russian and Romanian, with limited exposure to Western languages. This made professional integration particularly difficult, forcing some highly educated family members to take menial jobs while they developed language skills. Cultural adaptation proved just as challenging as language acquisition. Family members had to learn to navigate democratic societies with different social norms, legal systems, and economic structures. Some struggled with the loss of the hierarchical certainties that had defined their lives under communism. The financial challenges were also significant. While some family members had managed to transfer assets abroad before the revolution, most found themselves starting over with limited resources. Building new lives required not just adapting to new cultures, but also learning new skills and finding ways to support themselves without the patronage networks they had relied on in Romania. As the immediate post-revolutionary period gave way to a more stable but still evolving democratic Romania, some Ceaușescu family members began exploring possibilities for rehabilitation and social reintegration. These efforts took various forms and met with varying degrees of success. Some family members chose the path of public confession and apology. They gave interviews to Romanian and international media, acknowledging their complicity in the regime's crimes and expressing remorse for their actions. These public statements were risky, as they confirmed family members' involvement in the communist system, but they also offered a way to demonstrate genuine repentance. The effectiveness of public apologies varied greatly depending on the specific family member and the nature of their previous role. Those who had held relatively minor positions and could demonstrate that they had tried to help people within their limited sphere of influence received more sympathetic treatment. However, those who had been actively involved in repression or propaganda faced continued skepticism regardless of their expressions of remorse. Educational and professional rehabilitation proved more promising than public relations efforts. Some family members returned to universities to acquire new credentials that weren't tainted by their political past. Others developed expertise in areas that were desperately needed in post-communist Romania, such as business management, foreign languages, or technical skills. Charitable work became another avenue for attempted rehabilitation. Some family members became involved in organizations helping victims of the communist regime, working with orphanages, or supporting democratic institutions. While these efforts were sometimes viewed with suspicion, they also provided opportunities to demonstrate genuine commitment to positive change. The most successful rehabilitation efforts seemed to be those that were sustained over many years and demonstrated consistent behavior rather than dramatic gestures. Family members who quietly contributed to their communities, maintained ethical standards in their professional lives, and avoided seeking publicity gradually earned acceptance from some sectors of Romanian society. Religious conversion or renewed religious faith became important for some family members seeking redemption. The Orthodox Church in Romania, which had suffered under communist rule, provided a framework for confession, penance, and spiritual renewal. Some family members found that religious communities were more willing to accept them than secular society. However, rehabilitation efforts also faced significant obstacles. Many Romanians remained deeply suspicious of anyone associated with the former regime, viewing attempts at rehabilitation as calculated public relations rather than genuine repentance. The depth of trauma inflicted by the communist system made forgiveness extremely difficult for many victims and their families. The economic transformation of Romania after 1989 created particular challenges for Ceaușescu family members, who went from enjoying privileged access to resources to facing severe financial hardship. Understanding their economic downfall provides insight into both the extent of their previous privileges and the completeness of their fall from grace. During the communist era, high-ranking party officials and their families enjoyed what economists call socialist privilege, access to goods, services, and opportunities that were denied to ordinary citizens. This wasn't just about higher salaries, though those were significant. More importantly, it was about access to special stores, foreign currency, imported goods, better housing, healthcare, education, and travel opportunities. The Ceaușescu family's economic privileges went far beyond those of typical party officials. They had access to multiple residences, luxury automobiles, imported foods and clothing, and what amounted to unlimited state resources for personal use. Some family members had accumulated significant personal wealth through various means, including gifts from foreign dignitaries and profits from state-controlled businesses. When the regime collapsed, these economic privileges disappeared immediately. Properties were seized, bank accounts were frozen, and assets were subject to investigation for their origins. Family members who had never worried about money suddenly found themselves unable to access basic necessities. The psychological impact of this economic shock was often as devastating as the political consequences. The transition to a market economy created additional challenges for family members seeking to rebuild their financial lives. They had to learn to navigate systems based on competition rather than political connections. Skills that had been valuable in the communist system, such as political maneuvering and ideological orthodoxy, became liabilities in the new economy. Some family members discovered that their previous positions had actually left them poorly prepared for market competition. They had never needed to develop entrepreneurial skills, customer service abilities, or the kind of practical competencies that became essential in the new economy. This forced many to start over at entry-level positions despite their advanced age and previous high status. The banking and credit systems in early post-communist Romania were primitive and often corrupt, making it difficult for anyone to access capital for business ventures. For family members whose names were associated with the former regime, obtaining credit or investment was nearly impossible. This created a barrier to entrepreneurship that was difficult to overcome. Some family members turned to informal economic activities, small trading, craft production, or service provision, that didn't require significant capital investment or formal credentials. These activities often provided subsistence-level income rather than prosperity, but they offered independence from employers who might discriminate against family members. The most successful economic rehabilitation stories involved family members who were able to leverage legitimate skills or expertise that remained valuable in the new economy. Technical knowledge, language abilities, or specialized professional training could sometimes overcome political liabilities if family members were willing to work harder and accept lower compensation than their competitors. The psychological impact of the Ceaușescu family's fall from power extended far beyond the immediate fear for their physical safety. The comprehensive nature of their social, economic, and political collapse created trauma that affected family members for decades after the initial events of December 1989. The concept of privileged trauma helps explain the unique psychological challenges faced by family members. Unlike victims of political persecution, who could draw on social support and moral clarity about their suffering, Ceaușescu family members faced trauma while simultaneously dealing with guilt, shame, and social isolation. Their suffering was real, but not socially acknowledged or supported. Identity dissolution was perhaps the most fundamental psychological challenge. Family members had to confront the reality that their entire sense of self had been built on false foundations. They had believed themselves to be important, respected, and morally justified in their actions. The revolution forced them to confront the possibility that they had been complicit in genuine evil. The loss of social connections was particularly devastating for family members who had enjoyed extensive social networks based on their political status. Friendships, professional relationships, and even family connections were severed overnight. The isolation that resulted was profound and long-lasting, as building new relationships required concealing or overcoming their family history. Some family members developed what psychologists recognize as complex grief, a form of mourning that becomes complicated by guilt, anger, and unresolved conflicts. They were grieving not just for Nicolae and Elena, but for their entire way of life, their social status, and their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. Post-traumatic stress symptoms were common among family members, particularly those who had witnessed violence during the revolution or faced immediate threats to their safety. However, seeking psychological help was complicated by the fact that mental health professionals might view them as perpetrators rather than victims of trauma. Survivors' guilt affected many family members who had escaped the fate of Nicolae, Elena, and Moran. They struggled with questions about why they had survived when others had died, and whether they deserved to rebuild their lives given their past complicity in the regime's crimes. This guilt often interfered with their ability to fully engage in rehabilitation efforts. Some family members developed what could be described as historical whiplash, a disorienting experience of having their understanding of recent history completely reversed. Events and people they had viewed as positive were now understood to be negative, and vice versa. This cognitive dissonance created ongoing psychological stress. The most psychologically resilient family members seem to be those who were able to develop what psychologists call narrative coherence, the ability to construct a consistent story about their lives that acknowledged both their past mistakes and their potential for positive change. This often required years of reflection and sometimes professional psychological support. Understanding the fate of the Ceaușescu siblings requires examining how ordinary Romanians viewed the family in the aftermath of the revolution. Public opinion played a crucial role in determining which family members could successfully reintegrate into society and which remained pariahs. The immediate post-revolutionary period was marked by intense anger and desire for revenge against anyone associated with the former regime. Decades of oppression, economic hardship, and political persecution had created enormous resentment that was finally free to express itself. The Ceaușescu family became a natural target for this anger, representing not just political oppression, but also the stark inequality that had characterized communist Romania. Public opinion was influenced by the gradual revelation of the regime's crimes and excesses. As details emerged about the luxury enjoyed by the Ceaușescu family, while ordinary Romanians suffered, anger intensified. The contrast between the family's palaces and the poverty of average citizens became a powerful symbol of the regime's hypocrisy and cruelty. However, Romanian attitudes toward the family weren't uniformly negative. Some citizens, particularly in rural areas where Nicolae had grown up, retained some sympathy for the family, or at least opposed violent revenge. These voices were often silent during the immediate post-revolutionary period, but became more audible as emotions cooled. The Orthodox Church played a significant role in shaping public opinion about forgiveness versus vengeance. While many clergy had suffered under communist rule, the Church's teachings about redemption and forgiveness provided a framework for considering whether family members deserved second chances. This religious perspective influenced some Romanians to support rehabilitation efforts. Generational differences also affected public opinion. Older Romanians who had lived through the worst of the communist period were generally less forgiving than younger people who had limited memories of the regime. However, some older citizens also remembered periods when conditions had been better under Ceaușescu, creating complex and sometimes contradictory attitudes. Regional variations in public opinion reflected the uneven impact of communist policies. Areas that had benefited from industrialization or development projects associated with the regime sometimes retained more positive memories of the Ceaușescu era. However, regions that had suffered particularly severely from collectivization or other policies showed more intense hostility toward the family. The media played a crucial role in shaping public opinion about individual family members. Those who were featured prominently in newspapers and television programs as symbols of the regime's excesses faced more intense public hostility. Family members who managed to avoid media attention had better chances of successful reintegration. As time passed, some segments of Romanian society became more willing to judge family members based on their individual actions rather than their family connections. This evolution in public opinion created opportunities for rehabilitation, but only for those family members who demonstrated genuine commitment to positive change over sustained periods. The fates of the Ceaușescu siblings highlight key traits that aid survival in extreme circumstances: adaptability, humility, and resilience. Those who adjusted quickly, accepted modest lives, and built new skills fared far better than those clinging to past privilege. Success often came to those who learned practical skills, adapted socially, and relocated to escape the shadow of their family name. Early efforts at reinvention during the post-revolution chaos proved more effective than delayed attempts. Psychological recovery was strongest in those who acknowledged their past while seeking to contribute positively to society. For some, losing power opened the door to more meaningful, authentic lives. As Romania stabilized and developed into a functioning democracy over the decades following 1989, the situation for surviving Ceaușescu family members continued to evolve. The passage of time brought both opportunities and new challenges as the country grappled with its communist past. By the 2000s, Romania was preparing for European Union membership, which required the country to address its history more systematically. This process included both official recognition of communist-era crimes and efforts to promote reconciliation. For Ceaușescu family members, this created a complex environment where their past was neither forgotten nor necessarily disqualifying. Some family members found that professional opportunities expanded as Romania's economy grew and diversified. The desperate need for experienced professionals in various fields sometimes outweighed concerns about family background, particularly for those who had demonstrated competence and ethical behavior over many years. However, certain sectors, particularly government service and high-profile business positions, remained largely closed to family members. The younger generation of the family faced different challenges than their parents and grandparents. By the 2000s and 2010s, many had established successful careers and families, often in fields far removed from politics. Some had achieved sufficient professional success that their family background became less relevant to their daily lives, though it never completely disappeared. Educational achievements became particularly important for the family's rehabilitation. Several family members pursued advanced degrees, both in Romania and abroad, demonstrating their commitment to legitimate accomplishment. Some even entered academic careers, contributing to Romanian scholarship and intellectual life despite their family history. The advent of the internet and social media created new challenges for family members seeking to maintain low profiles. Information about their past became more easily accessible, and maintaining anonymity became increasingly difficult. Some family members found their carefully constructed new identities threatened by online discussions and historical research. However, the digital age also created opportunities. Some family members used online platforms to share their perspectives on Romanian history, contribute to discussions about communist-era crimes, or even offer apologies to those harmed by the regime. These digital forums sometimes provided more neutral spaces for dialogue than traditional media. The European Union membership process forced Romania to confront its communist past more systematically, leading to official investigations and documentation of regime crimes. This process created both risks and opportunities for family members. Risks of renewed scrutiny, but also opportunities to contribute to historical understanding and reconciliation efforts. By the 2010s, some family members had achieved a form of quiet respectability within Romanian society. They were known in their local communities as reliable professionals, good neighbors, or contributing citizens. While their family history was not forgotten, It no longer defined their entire social identity in the way it had in the immediate post-revolutionary period. The Ceaușescu siblings' post-regime experiences have drawn interest from scholars studying how families of fallen dictators cope after authoritarian collapse. Their story offers valuable insights not only for Romania, but for other nations undergoing similar transitions. Like other dictatorial families, the Ceaușescus faced danger, social rejection, and financial ruin. However, the violent overthrow, deep family involvement in the regime, and Romania's unique context made their situation particularly complex. The international community, while supporting Romania's democratization, offered little protection to former regime associates, limiting the family's options. Researchers have used the Ceaușescus as a case study in resilience, identity rebuilding, and adaptation after extreme status loss. Romania's mix of initial punishment followed by selective reintegration stands in contrast to harsher or more lenient approaches in other post-authoritarian societies. Human rights groups have raised concerns about collective punishment and due process, questioning whether all family members were treated fairly. Scholars have also examined the family's economic downfall as a reflection of communist-era privilege and post-revolution reform. Psychological studies show a wide range of outcomes, from trauma and despair to successful reinvention, offering a deeper understanding of how people endure and adapt in the wake of political catastrophe. The fate of Nicolae Ceaușescu's siblings after his 1989 execution raises complex questions about justice, guilt by association, and the legacy of authoritarian rule. In the revolution's aftermath, Romania's desire for justice often veered toward vengeance, and while the dictator's death brought closure for some, it left his family facing varied outcomes, from tragedy to quiet reinvention. Some believe the siblings deserved consequences due to the privileges and power they enjoyed under the regime. Others argue that collective punishment, especially for those with minor roles or acts of kindness, was unfair. Over time, more nuanced views have emerged. Some family members found redemption and contributed positively to society. Others remained socially excluded or unrepentant. Their stories highlight the enduring effects of political evil, the difficulty of separating individual guilt from family ties, and the potential for resilience and reinvention. The Ceaușescu name still carries a heavy legacy, but the siblings' experiences offer insight into how individuals navigate life after dictatorship. Ultimately, their lives remind us that political regimes impact real people, and that in the aftermath, justice, mercy, and humanity must all be considered. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.